Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel. I'm so looking forward to it. Thank you for joining us for the 70th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is Eliza Wollison. I'm the Managing Director of a Human Rights Prize called Women Have Wings. I'm also a graduate in anthropology from CU. I'll be serving as today's moderator. For recording purposes, today's date is Thursday, April 16th, 2026, 11 o'clock a.m., and the panel title is The World's Last Group Project, Are Intergovernmental Organizations Still Relevant? Now, before we get started, I'd like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American territories and ancestral homelands of the nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, and consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you once again. Welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all of our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Please silence your phones. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We'll take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and a producer will give you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly and raise your hand when you have a completed card, and a producer will collect it and bring it to me. And now I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I remind the audience that full speaker bios can be found online at the CWA website. And just to very briefly introduce them, we're lucky to have Lizzie Shackelford and Lorraine Bowles, a powerhouse pairing of a dissenting diplomat and a White House insider. So I'll leave it to them to give a little short intro of them.
Thank you, Eliza. Really happy to be here. I'm Lizzie Shackelford. I am a former diplomat. I resigned under the first Trump administration due to policy disagreements with the administration. I had served a lot of my career in Africa and some in Europe and then Washington, D.C. as well. Since then, I have taken to really appreciating and enjoying the free speech that one has when one leaves the government, because you don't have that inside the government. And so I really, when I kind of left the government, went back to private life, one of my biggest priorities was kind of trying to explain what the hell it was we were doing over there as diplomats and why U.S. engagement in the world really mattered. And so I I started speaking anywhere that anyone would have me. I worked on and then ultimately published a book called The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, which talks about challenges of US foreign affairs, foreign policy, not just under the Trump administration, but how some of these challenges and problems had really been rooted in our foreign policy and our role in the world for a long time. But I really intertwined it with kind of my own experience, I went in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and kind of, the scales fell off my eyes, and I'm like, oh goodness, this is how it really works out there. I put that book out there. I started teaching. I teach now. I lecture at Dartmouth College. I live in Vermont, which is across the state border from there. And I have a column in the Chicago Tribune where my goal really is to break down complicated foreign affairs issues for a generalist public audience. So I'm very happy to be here because I feel like I get to kind of exercise some of that as well.
I'm the generalized public audience, just to be clear. Thank you, Eliza, and really happy to be here at the conference. I've really enjoyed it. My name is Lorraine Voles, and I was most recently Chief of Staff to Vice President Kamala Harris. I've had a career not in foreign policy, but everything I've done, I guess, has been affected by foreign policy. This is actually my second tour of duty at the White House. I worked in the Clinton administration for Vice President Gore. Excuse me. Sorry. And I've done 2 stints in the Senate, so the United States Senate. So I'm happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
So through this conversation and insightful questions from the floor, I just want to note that if anybody does have questions as we proceed, if you could just raise your hand and then bring you a card. These two will help us figure out if the world's most important group project, the world of intergovernmental organizations, is actually worth saving. Shackelford brings the perspective of someone who saw where the gears of the State Department ground to a halt, while Voles brings the strategic lens of the Biden-Harris administration and the Al Gore era. So, Lizzie, in your book, The Dissent Channel, you describe how American diplomacy often prioritizes short-term political needs over long-term principles. Lorraine, you've spent your career at the highest level of the White House managing these very political realities. When it comes to international IGOs like the UN or NATO, how do we bridge the gap between the high-minded theoretical of global cooperation and the gritty, often messy reality of domestic political survival?
Okay, all right. Well, you've presented some good, a good kind of high-level question from basically the American's perspective. Before I kind of delve into that, though, I want to kind of rein back a little bit more for the audience and talk a little bit, just briefly, if it's okay, about what are these international organizations? I assume if you showed up to this, you probably care about international organizations, but just in case anybody wandered into the wrong room, I'll just kind of give you a little background on it. We know the UN, we know kind of like the biggest umbrella organizations, but when we talk, I love this title to this panel, The World's Last Group Project, because A, I hate group projects, but B, I do think that these international organizations are incredibly important, and it is worth doing the painstaking effort of kind of collaboration and trying to get consensus in these spaces, because international organizations affect us every single day. And while from the news, you might think that the answer to this question is that they're not relevant because laws of war aren't being followed, because the US administration today is blatantly ignoring a lot of what's happening, because frankly, it's not the first administration to ignore the role of international institutions and international law, which is where international organizations play a really big role. We have had this challenge for a long time where the biggest countries, I'd love to hear Lorraine talk about kind of the White House perspective on the annoying aspects of UN General Assembly resolutions and things of that nature. But just to put in perspective why these organizations are still relevant, they affect us all the time. The international postal system, international telecoms, the fact that our times are all synced with times across the entire world. The fact that we have basic safety standards for things like international travel, the fact that we have borders that are actually respected in most parts of the world, GPS, globally effective apps that are on your phone that work whether or not you're an American citizen or live somewhere across the world. All of that, all of those systems are built and governed and managed by international organizations. So this is kind of a long roundabout way of saying that it is difficult. The US role vis-a-vis international organizations is a fraught one and was a fraught one long before the situation that we're in today. But I don't think even the most skeptical of the kind of Trump administration of international roles and rules and regulations would want us to just be guessing whether or not our plane's going to land at the time that our watch would say that it is, for example. So they're incredibly relevant. The question is, what has the interaction between big powers like the United States and these international organizations, what has that done to the strength of that system and how it works? And what is the fallout from that? What is the impact on us in this room today and people in Kenya or Cambodia or Brazil on the fact that we have absolutely been weakening the role of these international organizations? So I don't think I answered your question at all.
No. I appreciate you unpacking. I think it's really important that we do this first and foremost. Perhaps you could shine a little light on in your perspective.
I also think the intergovernmental agencies or organizations are still incredibly relevant. I do have a perspective, though, from just day to day when governing and when you're at the White House, it's actually the regional organizations that have more of an impact. And I have my little cheat sheet here because I don't want to misspeak, but the European Union, NATO, the African Union, OAS, those were the organizations in my day-to-day work that I would hear about. You are correct. Like when we were talking about the United Nations, it was usually because it was a headache. But I still think incredibly important because I have a different perspective on that from other work that I've done. So I do think that they do provide a structure for an interconnected world, which I think is really important. And, the bigger countries, yeah, they can solve a lot of problems, but they can't solve all the problems. And so I think that these interconnected organizations really help us deal with a lot of the global problems that we see every day.
Thank you for the double of the unpacking of the issue. So now that we've kind of got the good groundwork of what we're talking about here, you've both navigated massive bureaucracies, one from the Foreign Service and the other from the West Wing. In a world where power politics is now the loudest voice in the room, do these massive intergovernmental organizations still offer a viable path for real change, or are they increasingly just theaters for performance?
So in my work, so much of the global work happens on a one-to-one basis, not through the intergovernmental agencies. So it's a bilateral meeting with President Zelensky and President Biden, or Vice President Harris and Zelensky, or Vice President Harris and he is no longer the Chancellor of Germany, but he was at the time. Like those, I don't know that that's really where so much of the work takes place, that a leader would come from a foreign country and you would see all the pomp and circumstance at the White House, and then they would have a meeting with the president and his aides, and then oftentimes they would have a meeting with the vice president and her aides. And I think a lot of the pre-work on that was done with the State Department and the National Security Office was, okay, you're going to do this piece, and she's going to do this piece to get to the results that would hopefully lead to some kind of progress. So that was more my experience with how the work got done. Having said that, and I'm sure you can talk about this much more eloquently, the importance of the organizations like NATO, we're just extremely important. Again, the relationships. And I think very early on, I wasn't even the Vice President's Chief of Staff, so forgive me if I don't get all these details right. I was a consultant helping out. And she was dispatched to Paris to meet with Macron because he was upset because we sold helicopters to someone he wanted to sell helicopters to. That diplomacy, that one-on-one diplomacy, putting the relationship back on track, was super important because NATO was so important. So that's how I don't know if you followed that circle, but hopefully you did. I know very well that's my friend Tom in the back just starting the applause.
It's good to have good friends. I love that you kind of answered that question by talking about, a scenario where Zelensky comes to the White House, because I think that this is an example of kind of why international organizations are so important to the rest of the world. A prime minister or president of a small middle country comes to the White House, and the power dynamic is the White House and your small, medium-sized country, leader, ambassador, president, whatnot. And so when we talk about these big bureaucracies, let's talk about the big bureaucracy that is, international organizations. This is a space where not only do you get to come like the United Nations General Assembly, one country is one country is one country. The United States has obviously a lot of pull on the international stage. But this is also a place where there is a little bit more level setting by other countries on Earth. You're not showing up at this incredibly impressive historic, seat of power of the world's hegemon. You are one country, and one country's representative in a large organization. Now, that sounds kind of Pollyannish because, of course, the United States vote and concern and position matters more. But you know what can happen in international organizations? How many people here heard or read the Mark Carney speech at Davos? All right. That's what I'm talking about. The middle powers, Mark Carney got this right, they can come together and they can bring together their value and build their leverage as a collective of states with similar interests in, for example, rule of law, free trade, etc. And the international organizations are a very heavy bureaucracy that is can be very difficult to navigate, but it gives a structure and a platform around which these other countries who all have very strong interests in what the policies are of the rest of the world, the rest of the world's countries, they can come together and say, we're going to get our vote, we're going to get our voting bloc, we're going to get the leverage of all of our trade exports, imports, and we're going to collectively bring this position. And I think that Mark Carney really did a fantastic job of highlighting that, this is not to say, we're putting all of our faith in international organizations. This is not to say that we think that, international law is this high and mighty thing that actually functions above. We're going to be honest. It doesn't really work that well, but it gives us a place from which to build our power against those other centers of power, and we can only do it together, and international organizations create the structure in which they can do that. In terms of the massive bureaucratic organization of the State Department, and whether, to your question of whether real change can happen within that, I do think that's an interesting question because, one of my efforts to try and change things from the inside, the State Department, like any bureaucracy, is driven in many, many ways and forms by inertia. So is the international system. The State Department people have been pushing for really big changes to, kind of our hiring and promotion systems, to, the role that different bureaus have in terms of their weight of opinion. Let's say the DRL, which was the Human Rights Bureau, in terms of their weight when they say we shouldn't be, sending weapons to country X. Those things are very hard to break within an institution because of inertia and, in general drag. And I found when I was on the inside, the reason I did resign was because I felt like I was not in a position to change it. The good news with what's happening today, and I would say this applies both to kind of government institutions inside the US, but also international organizations, is that it's not good news that we're experiencing this complete rupture and fraction and destruction, which we are. But that does create a space in which, unlike 10 years ago when I was trying to build this change on the inside, and I was coming up against just really dug in, rooted in resistance. I think that these types of moments of change can really can compel the necessity to build out different systems and different ways of doing things. So it's a risky time, both in the State Department, which has been in many, many ways gutted, and in international orgs, where taking away so much US support and funding has really been disastrous. The hope that I have for the future for these is that we do realize that diplomacy is incredibly important. I'm sorry, you can't send two real estate buddies of the president and try and like solve complex wars. There are skills. It's a tradecraft involved there, and they don't have it. So we need diplomacy, we need diplomats. I think people, maybe even this past week, are recognizing how much we actually miss them now that they're gone. And in the international organizations as well, I think that people are going to recognize, maybe not in the United States, but in countries around the world, what an important role they play. And so should we have an opportunity for real reform? In the States, it's going to require an administration that cares about and values diplomacy to have that kind of necessary reform in the State Department. In international orgs, it actually doesn't require the United States. It requires the rest of the world to say, our strength is together, and if we want to protect our interests against, aggression from the outside that is looking at the world as a zero-sum game, then we've got to work together, and we should find some ways to do that primarily inside, those organizations that can support it.
Did you have a comment also to respond, in response? So I have some wonderful student questions. I'm going to give them priority. This first question has a little bit to do with the fact that the U.S. has backed out of, I think it's around 61 intergovernmental responsibilities that we had signed on to, one of them being UN Women, which I'm very deeply committed to, and the vacuum that might be created as a result of this. So the student asks, what would the implications of the United States be, what would the implications be if the United States left NATO?
You answer that first.
I'm earning credit here. We're going to get a really hard question. I'm going to make Lorraine do it. If we leave NATO, well, here's the truth. At this point, it's really a question of semantics, because at this stage, the President of the United States has already made it abundantly clear that he does not believe in the organization, and that he has raised questions fundamentally about whether or not we would show up and meet our requirements. I will say, I'm sure military friends of mine, my husband probably one of them, would be like, actually, if we really pulled out, there are all these things that we'd have to rework inside of like the structure and what would respond. Okay, I'm not answering that question. I'm answering the question of the strength of NATO as a deterrent force. And the strength of NATO as a deterrent force, which was really what it was created to be, has already been massively undermined. And what we would require at this stage, when you already see, other NATO members are already trying to plan around a future without the United States, because though we have not officially left NATO, we have withdrawn that guarantee that if someone attacks you, the United States and its military is going to show up. And that trust that the US is going to do it, that's the power and the strength of NATO. And so even though right now, still technically the United States is a part, we've really thoroughly undermined it. So what do we think is gonna happen? Now I think over time we're gonna see the EU, they're already building up their defenses, they're already finding ways to be able to respond without the United States. They're already starting to figure out that they're gonna have to fund their defense budgets higher and probably not have as much fantastic social services as many of those countries do. But I think that the reality is the US role inside NATO now is much less valuable than it was in the past. And for those who think that it's about time Europe figured that out, we have strategically for decades been designing it so that NATO was reliant on us. And that was in the United States' interest. And so I think on the flip side of this, we're going to find that our inability to direct NATO and to really kind of control it is going to be a cost to us in the long term too.
I mean, I do think if the United States pulls out of NATO, it's a new world order. It's just that dramatic. It just changes kind of the legacy of our country and our country's leadership in Europe and beyond. I will say, so many times with this president, there's a grain of something. He starts with a little grain of something. And with NATO, he started with no one's paying their fair share. We're paying everything, no one's paying their fair share. And that message resonated with people. We're like, well, everyone should pay their fair share. You know, we're not over there. Like, everyone should pay their fair share. And, you know, he throws out numbers, true or not true, 2%, 4%. You know, Susan Rice and John Bolton were talking about this the other evening. So I think, you know, there's always a grain, and he kind of gets to this little grain, and he just, that people think like, oh, well, okay, like if we're going to be in NATO, they have to pay their fair share. Not thinking about not thinking about the historical start of NATO, why we're in NATO, why NATO started, and when is it Act 9 of NATO when we call after 9/11, when the NATO countries came together, which is the only time they've ever had to come together to for one of the members, and the member was us, was the United States, and they were all there. So it's that's why I say I think it's a really dramatic change in the world order.
Really interesting perspective. And could you shine a little light on the vacuum that's created and who might be stepping in?
Well, it depends in terms of the vacuum and who's going to step in. It depends on which organizations you're talking about. If you're talking about UN Women, for example, which I do think has done some really great work in the world, UN Women, the U.S. government has not had the best leadership in it anyway for a while. But there are other states that really prioritize and really value it. And Eliza, you probably know this better than I do, but my past experience with UN Women is that the Nordic countries have played a really big role. They've been big funders of a lot of programs through it. And so you're going to have smaller countries that have a vested interest or a particular interest in that topic, and they're going to be the ones who fill it out. The funding shortfalls will still likely be a problem in terms of what all can be done. But let's say you're talking about, the World Health Organization. That's a different story from UN Women. World Health Organization, I think we're seeing that countries like China are trying to play a bigger role because they want to have more control over what's going to happen with that in the future. We're seeing with I'm going to forget exactly, this news came out just a couple of days ago where it was the World, this is like such relevant news that I'm trying to pull it out of my tired brain. It was, wasn't refugees, but anyway, there is a large UN organization that is always headed by an American, World Food Program. And always headed by an American. Don't check me on this, I could be getting it wrong. But the concept behind this is that they are no longer going to let an American, they're not going to look to the United States to play the leadership role because we are no longer funding or supporting the values behind that institution. And what that means is that we're losing our influence over that organization and over where we're going to prioritize which crises around the world are going to get funded and focused on. And so I think that we're going to lose our influence. And in some places, I don't think the Trump administration cares about losing influence over UN Women. But I do think that there are a lot of these other spaces where, as China is a major player and starts really getting its tentacles in much more of the United Nations leadership structure because we are stepping away, because of that vacuum, what the international order is going to be pushing out to the world is going to look a lot more like what China wants it to look like than what we want it to look like. And that's really where that international leadership in these international organizations makes a big difference in terms of kind of our own national security interest. And so, I would watch this space. I think that it doesn't just have influence over, let's say, what the World Food Program does. But in those rooms, those diplomats who are around those tables are going to be listening to leadership coming out of China, and they're going to be appreciating the support that is coming from China. And you're going to start seeing votes and trade and tourism and students and all that type of thing go to places that are not the United States. And the knock-on effect of our lack of influence in the world is just going to accumulate.
So it's really interesting because the question now is, well, if the intergovernmental agencies are still relevant, maybe it's the United States that's not relevant. That's what all this conversation seems to be leading. And I think about the UN, I do work for Save the Children. Save the Children has a UN representative, has a representative to the UN. Now, is their work relevant? You bet. And prolific. So it's just making me think about the US's role. So I will say one thing about China, which I think is really interesting. When I was working for Vice President Harris, we made a trip to Africa, to the continent. And we went to Ghana, Zambia, and Tanzania. And in Ghana, there were new stadiums, new roads, and another structure. And we were just asking about it when we got to, we were in the motorcade, so we asked when we got to the hotel. It's all supported by China. But interestingly, not people from Ghana building the roads, people from China building the roads, people from China building the stadium. And that was a very different approach than the United States used to take when the aid and work was still robust. So they are making inroads into these countries that I agree with Lizzie are going to have just enormous impact, but they do it differently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Another student question. What's the intergovernmental organization that's most likely to collapse within the next decade?
Gotta give this one some thought. I actually think in the next decade, we will probably see a lot of consolidation. And this goes back to the same thing that I was mentioning theme before of the difficulties and struggles with U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy did not start under the Trump administration. There were these problems that were there before that were making it very hard to kind of reform and have a better foreign policy in a lot of ways. But then they became very exacerbated under Trump 1 and then now Trump 2. You've seen a similar thing with the United Nations. There are a lot of organizations under it. And there are a lot that have overlapping mandates. So many overlapping mandates. And what happens, it's a lot like kind of presidential initiatives in the United States. President so-and-so comes in and creates this really cool, new initiative. And then that doesn't go away because it's got a constituency and it's got some folks in Congress who support it. And, and then another president comes in and doesn't really like that one, but it just keeps kind of doing its thing. But then that new president is like, I mean, that's an important thing to deal with, children, but I'd rather deal with children in this way. So you create another little organization, probably with another special envoy. So many special envoys. And so they just start kind of overlapping. And we see this in the United Nations, and you will have kind of new institutions and organizations created because they are, the pet project of a particular bloc or of a particular country, and then they will continue doing their thing, but another institution will be created on top of it. So this probably wasn't what the student was going for, because I do think that there is a real fear that we're going to see, particularly, the World Health Organization situation right now is very bleak, and that would be very, very bad for the world if that were to collapse. This attempt of the Trump administration to create kind of overlapping institutions like his Board of Peace in order to kind of steal and take away some of the turf of international organizations is a problem. But I think one thing that could actually come out of the kind of the rupture that we've been seeing in the international organization system is that some of this consolidation that has been desperately necessary for many, many years now might be forced. The shortfalls on the budget might actually demand that they start making really hard choices, and that actually could be something that helps to rationalize some of the international efforts. The UN has become an institution that does everything well beyond what its original mandate was. There are pros and cons to a lot of what it's doing, but in terms of what institutions might collapse, I think you will see institutions that are not essential or that are not the only ones that have mandate X that start to consolidate, and as they just have to find ways to thin their budgets.
This is not my area of expertise, so I don't really know enough about how robust these organizations are. But I agree with Lizzie. I think that especially the United Nations, there's so much, and sometimes it can be such a maze to really figure out where you have to go to get the information or the support, you're looking for, that I do think that there will be consolidation there and other places, but I just don't have the expertise to tell the student or to even offer an opinion about what might collapse.
To that point, just yesterday, Guy Ryder, the Undersecretary General of the UN, came out with a report on UN 80, and he said that by September of this year, there would be an app or a way in which civil society could actually use an app to figure out who's doing what and reduce the amount of duplication, because I think that the duplication is what we're talking about here, and there is a tremendous amount of duplication. So I'm a little bit hopeful that something will appear in September. This is another student question, and maybe we could answer this and connect it to the conversation that we've been having around intergovernmental organizations. Why did Trump start the war in Iran, and what lasting impacts will the war have across the world and in organizations?
I mean, I think you'd have to be a psychologist to totally know why he started the war in Iran. He started the war in Iran in some ways because our system of checks and balances that is supposed to prevent us from going into, unwise wars of choice has, again, not a new problem, a long-standing problem. That system of checks and balances has completely collapsed. I think it can be defined as Congress not doing its job. But what we have seen with that, and to link it back to the international organizations situation, is, we've had total failure of Congress to do its job in terms of reining in and insisting on public debate around decisions this critical as whether or not we are going to send America's military into harm's way and put at risk civilians around the world. But international organizations, I would say less willfully and more because of these innate weaknesses, international organizations haven't been able to do their part to rein that in either. And this is one of the fundamental challenges of international law. The war in Iran is illegal. It's illegal under US law, it's illegal under international law, it is a war of aggression, there is no self-defense justification for it. We do have a system of, laws of war and laws of, of how to prosecute war, and this does not meet any of the requirements. But we do not have an international system where you can hold a hegemon to account. And so that is where we are. We don't have a way to rein in these types of acts of the United States. And I can say, a similar example to this, where you've got failings of both the international system and Congress, is what's been happening off the coast of Venezuela and the Caribbean with the attacks on the fishing boats, essentially. I don't remember the number now, but it's well over 100 people who have been murdered by the US military in strikes in what is not a declared armed conflict of any sort. And so, we need to have a lot more outrage, public outrage over this war, international outrage over the war. We haven't seen the kind of protests over this war as we saw, 20 years ago with the war in Iraq, for example. We haven't seen those types of protests really heavily at, the United Nations General Assembly. And part of that is because over time, people have kind of gotten wary and just weary of trying to fight a hegemon that doesn't listen to the rules. And because there hasn't been really any accountability coming on the other side of it. So I would encourage everyone who cares about these things to talk to your elected members in Washington and let them know that you do care, that we are fighting a very expensive, unnecessary war that is destabilizing.
So I can't answer the question the student asked either, but I will offer this. In a previous panel that took place in this room earlier this morning that I participated in, one of the panelists suggested that the reason why we're at war, the reason why we went to war in Iran is to get off the Jeffrey Epstein files. Not my words, but it was offered as a reason in a panel this morning. The only thing I think there have been so many reasons given by this administration. I think Hegseth had a press conference this morning and gave a whole bunch of new reasons. I will say this is interesting to hear Lizzie talk about no international place to go and to talk to a tribunal, but there is the International Criminal Court. I mean, again, I understand why you say there's no real venue, because it's so weakened and does not carry clearly not the moral authority or the authority to try these things. They're supposed to prosecute individuals who are, I don't want to say guilty because I think that's the wrong thing to say, but genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression.
Can I just add on to that, because I think, so the ICC, we are not a party to. So that is one of the challenges. International Court of Justice, we are a party to, and that is a place where, Ukraine has brought Russia in, because that's where kind of like states versus states, basically you can bring cases against states. And so I do think that is, we have mechanisms. The challenge is that in the international law space, we have nothing that is above everyone, right? Inside a state, inside a country like the United States, the federal government reigns supreme, and so they can impose consequences. I think anyone who wants to try and take the U.S. government to court on these things has to deal with the political issues and the fallout, which we're starting to see some of that here in the States as well. So I think that these are, again, we haven't bought into it. International law is a little bit like Santa Claus. The more you believe in it, the more it works. And it's wonderful to believe in it, and it's wonderful for it to work. But the United States and the U.S. government doesn't really believe in it, and so the weaker states around the world have trouble using those mechanisms to hold us to account. The last point I'll make about why we ended up in war in Iran is also because of the failure of diplomacy. I mean, we don't know. Trump may well have gone to war anyway, but we did have people in the room who did not fundamentally understand what the Iranian delegation was putting on the table. We had absolute clowns across the table, from people who were, you can completely, have total disdain for their regime. They were professional diplomats who completely understood what they were doing and knew how to negotiate. And we didn't have that. And because of that, because they did not see progress, and because last weekend J.D. Vance didn't see progress in marathon 20 hours of negotiations, I do the air quotes because that is like the shortest negotiation I've ever heard of. Then, we didn't allow diplomacy to work, because this administration frequently likes to reach first or very, very quickly to what should be the tool of last resort of military intervention.
I don't think he wanted to use diplomacy at all. I don't think it was a factor, and I don't think he has respect for the diplomatic corps. I think this is what he wanted to do, and he just did it. I will say one other thing that you mentioned, which I totally agree with, is and this has been a problem in other areas. Where's Congress? Where's the outrage? Senator Kaine from Virginia has been out there, waving the flag and trying, but I think there was a vote yesterday, I think it was 53-47 or 52-47 against the war, but I mean, it's a capitulation of Congress yet again.
All really. Thank you, really all such important points. Here is another student question. If there is an organization that is considered a, quote, keystone organization that would collapse society if it failed, I think he's asking what would that organization be? I mean, you have to define collapse society. I have this debate with my husband all the time. He's like, America's over, the US is over. I'm like, it's still here. It doesn't look like what we...
And it's a baby.
And it's a baby. It's a baby. But, I mean, in terms of international organizations, with the collapse of any international organizations, kind of collapse society. In kind of like the most basic sense of society getting by, no, I don't think that would be the case. But I do think a fundamental collapse
of the United Nations would be, and what would that look like? What do we mean by kind of like a collapse of the United Nations? We mean like the United States paying absolutely none of its dues, so other countries, and the United States kind of not showing up anymore. And so other countries decide that, you know, if the US isn't going to play ball here, we're not going to bother paying our dues and showing up and giving credence to this institution because it doesn't matter. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think that if all of the middle powers gather together and they say this still matters and we're still going to use it as a mechanism, that would still work. But if the US pulling away causes enough other countries to say, you know, we're not going to play this group project either, it wouldn't necessarily cause the collapse of society, but it would cause the collapse of society as we know it, because you would start to find absolutely insurmountable obstacles to things like international trade, international post. International travel would become something very difficult to do. These other specific targeted institutions, I think the US would still stay part of. But if you got rid of the umbrella organization of kind of this sense of a community of nations, I think that all of those institutions underlying it would start to become far less effective, because the general sense that there are rules of the game that we play by would really start to go away. And what do I think this would mean practically speaking? It wouldn't happen overnight, but I think practically speaking, things like air travel would get more dangerous. You know, I think things like, you know, our ability to travel freely, which we as Americans have in a way that almost no other citizens do. I think obstacles would come up to that. You want to start, you know, you want to go to the EU, you're going to have to start getting a visa, and that's going to require you jumping through a whole lot of hoops. You want to go to other parts of the world, there's no more of that free tourist travel. You're going to have to pay hundreds of dollars, like people do now, to come to the United States. And you're going to have to wait months and months to see if your visa is going to be granted. So those are the types of things that would, I think, collapse society as we know it. Would people still find ways to get by? We would be in a more might makes right kind of world. Society would be there, but it would look very different.
I agree.
We got a double snap from Lorraine. Okay. Given the threat, this is another student question, I believe. Given the threat has increased to students and anyone really to speak out for peace, human rights, etc., i.e. Free Palestine, what are safe ways for civil society to speak up and influence the public sector now in this oppressive regime?
I think it's really important to speak up, and I think you have to just be careful, because if your speech is inciting violence, that's not going to be good for you. So I think the importance of speaking up, whether it's in your classroom, in your student newspaper, in the media in general, on social media, I think it's important. I think you have to be respectful, you have to be factual, and you have to find maybe media outlets who could amplify your message. But this became a big issue in the panel I was on previously about the press, and it's just the mis and disinformation that's out there can be so dangerous, especially the disinformation. So it's important that if you're going to take on powers that be factual, be respectful, and you know, don't do anything that could incite violence.
So I've gotten this question from a lot. I teach at Dartmouth, and I get this question from a number of my students who are like, you know, I really want to speak up about this, but what's it going to do? Like, what if I get arrested? You know, what will that do to my future and my career and that type of thing? And frankly, it just like crushes my soul. I mean, you're in college, you're young, you're at the stage where you're trying out different versions of yourself, you're trying to figure out what your values are and what you care about. And the fact that we have this like dampening, that was not the case when I was in college. The fact that we have this kind of dampening of free speech and free expression in the places where it should be exercised most, to me, is just really, it's heart-wrenching. But practical guidance here. I teach a class called Dissent and Democracy, and so I literally teach this for like an entire term, just talking about why dissent is so incredibly, incredibly important, but also that dissent does come with consequences. And so with every time you are considering how to speak out against injustice, speak out against an oppressive regime, you really do need to go through kind of a little bit of a practical checklist. And it involves things like, what am I? What is my dissent here? What is my act? Why am I doing this? What am I hoping to accomplish with my act? Know what your goal is and make sure that your act is attached to that goal, that you are able through what you're doing to accomplish that. Your goal might just be to build awareness, in which case a protest is a great way to do it. It might be to kind of force the powers that be to answer questions, and that's great. If you're like, my goal is to change this, and you're like, and I'm going to do that by holding my sign over here, I'm like, you're not going to change that policy by doing that. But if you so you've got to understand the limitations of what you can impact by that, so you can understand the risks. Because all of these questions, every time you make a decision about something like this, you've got to do that risk-benefit analysis. And I'll put it this way. I had a student who was an immigrant who was worried about a visa situation, and I was like, listen, what can you do the most good in? It's joining this very, very small protest on this particular day, or getting your degree so that you can, leave an oppressive country and try to build a career where you can actually, help promote human rights in the long run. That's not everybody's, kind of either or decision, but when you're looking at a scenario where a lot of people are getting arrested and kicked out of school, and you're on a visa and you could get kicked out, you've got to think about those things practically. But my challenge then is that the people who are at less risk have a much higher responsibility to do those actions on behalf of the people for whom it is too dangerous. And so if you are someone who is less likely to get targeted, or let's put it this way, if you're from a very connected family, so nobody's likely to throw you in jail, or even if you do, you're going to do perfectly fine anyway, consider, are you able on these occasions to write that op-ed in the student paper because you're going to be more protected or have less risk than your friend for whom those issues that are being debated are life and death, or their entire future. And so I think what you need to do is really think through, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What are the risks? And are those risks worth it in terms of other actions you can do? Are there other people you can go to ask them to kind of be there? Because there is strength in numbers as well. And I would say I agree with Lorraine. Anytime I have done anything on a dissenting path, have your receipts, know what you're talking about, make sure that you've got a very defensible and important position. It sounds very obvious. We all believe what we believe, but go and make sure that you're on the right side there. Really kind of interrogate your own position before you put yourself at risk for it. And that's just good life advice, I think.
It's wonderful. I want to take that class. It sounds wonderful. Could you share with us one of the books that is mandatory reading for the class?
Well, like many professors these days, I don't like to make people buy books because, nobody wants to. It's a whole collection because it's Dissent and Democracy in the World. And so it takes a lot of examples from across history and across the globe. And so I don't make anybody buy my book, but I do assign a couple of chapters from it. But I will say, we have an event with Malala tonight. Malala, on my very day one of class, is one of the people that I talk about. I have a few excerpts of things that she's written. I have some excerpts from Russian dissidents as well, and people who have really sacrificed their entire lives for dissent. And, I asked the students the questions of, what did they do this for? What was their goal? What did they accomplish? Was that the right move? And I'd say another kind of section of my course goes into the whistleblowers. And so Daniel Ellsberg, for example, with who was the big whistleblower in the Vietnam War, and kind of his story, and then kind of comparing it to what's your information that you have. So some people are dissenters and speak out because of their personal, it's their own life that is at risk and that's what they're fighting for. And other people, kind of another category of people, are the ones who are engaging in dissent because they have special access or special information in the government, that type of thing, and they know that what's happening is wrong. I'd say the last part is we have a section on how to effectively dissent. We read a number of things about how effective are protests? When are protests effective? When do they actually have real impact? And so there's some really interesting stuff out there about the 3.5% rule. I'm having trouble thinking of exact titles and authors, but 3.5% rule of protest, which is when you are able to mobilize 3.5% of the population all at one time against an incumbent government. That is when change really begins to happen, and I think that we've been starting to get close to that number here in the United States.
That's wonderful. Thank you. This is also from a student. What strategies can we I think, use to engage in to better legitimize the power of IGOs?
The power of what?
Of IGOs.
Oh, sorry.
What strategies?
What strategies?
It's a good question. And I guess the question is what we as individuals, or we as the US government. I'm guessing we're talking about kind of, we at the individual level, what can we do to better, what was the last part of that question? To better?
Bolster.
Bolster, okay. Yeah, it's a really tough thing for kind of individuals to impact. I think that I think the folks who are in a really good position to bolster the position of international organizations are a lot of these middle powers out there, and it's really kind of getting that power together. But I think the one thing kind of individuals can do, and something that I try and do in my day-to-day world, is I try to write about it, I try to speak about them, I try to basically just build awareness, let people know, this isn't theoretical stuff, and it's not all about big war and peace stuff. This is about whether or not the world that we work has norms and rules and kind of that every country abides by, so that we can kind of live functionally in this very globalized world. And so I'd say, just really build your own awareness about it. Do some research. Talk to people around you about it. If you hear your crazy uncle saying the UN, we shouldn't be funding that. That's way out there. Maybe have a conversation about what the UN actually does, what these international organizations do. But I do think that we're in a place where, if the US government is not going to be reinforcing or is going to be undermining them, it's really going to be up to the rest of the countries in the world to collectively decide that this is in their interest, and to take that role of really utilizing them in a positive way to get their leverage against other countries.
I think this is true about just about everything, is especially for the students. You have to educate yourself. You have to be an engaged citizen to know what's going on in the world. Why should you care about the UN? Why should you care about World Health? What's smallpox? I just think it's really important for citizens, especially the students who are just, forming their opinions, deciding on how they want to live their life, is to educate yourself about these organizations. If you agree with what they're doing, if you think they still have relevance, understand their successes and understand their failures, because there have been plenty of both for all these organizations. And I think that's actually true about just about any panel I've sat on or listened to this week, is we have to have an engaged citizenry.
These questions from students, there's a couple similar ones, but this one's an interesting question for you both. Are there any ways individuals in the military that are told these illegal acts can fight it, that are told to,
Yeah, we get the gist.
yeah, you get the gist.
I don't get the gist.
Is there anything that members of the military can do about receiving illegal orders?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Exactly.
The gist.
Yes, they can and are under a constitutional obligation to refuse illegal orders. There are some challenges there. One is that in the first weeks of this second Trump administration, they basically fired all the JAGs, all of the judge advocate generals, basically all of the people whose job it is to tell them whether or not these orders are legal. International law and domestic law are both, they're pretty complex. I am a recovering lawyer myself, and I can tell you, the law is, we can say, this is legal, don't do it. But refusing an order that's legal is, court-martialable. So if you're in the military and you're some 22-year-old kid who doesn't have a lot of experience in the world, and you're being told to push the button to drop this bomb on this place that you don't believe is a school, but is, we have to be realistic with the expectations that we put on our military. And under these circumstances, which this administration has specifically designed in order to make it harder and harder for the military to confidently reject orders. So I think that there are a lot of aspects of the military and people in the military that we have to be realistic about what they can do. Now, that said, military leadership has a very big responsibility here and needs to be very honest with themselves. And I actually think people on the outside who aspire to the highest public office in the future should be very crystal clear that there will be consequences, that there will be trials after all of this, and that people who claim that they were just following orders, but who knew better and who followed illegal orders that were very dangerous and led to a lot of innocent lives being lost, those people will need to stand trial. They need to, because as we learned in Nuremberg, just following orders is not a legal defense against war crimes. And so that's something that people need to be paying attention to. I am aware there are call lines. They're like nonprofit groups out there that are there to listen to people in the military who are stressed out about what they're being asked to do. People are starting to leave the military. I don't know the numbers, it's really anecdotal, but I read a piece the other day, I think it was in the New York Times, about how many more people are calling these helplines and saying that they're not sure they need to quit. How many more people are trying to find ways to consciously object. It's still a drop in the bucket for like a 2 million person military, but you are starting to hear of this. And so I think that we need, in terms of the kind of actionable question of what can people be doing, our elected officials need to be, we need more of that out there, people out there who have a platform saying, do not follow illegal orders, not just it's okay not to, but like you're under a constitutional obligation not to. And if you're afraid that it is, you need to go talk to somebody who knows before you actually go through with it. And so I think it's a lot of moral weight to put on our military, but I also think that when your job involves lethal actions, you should take that responsibility very seriously.
I think this is just one of the hardest things. This is just so terrible. You're putting these people in, so many of them are young. When you work at the White House, you work with a lot of military personnel, and they're so impressive. And so a lot of them are very young. They're trained, in the chain of command. So it's really, really difficult to do something like Lizzie is suggesting, to speak, your truth, but it's really, really hard to do. I wanted to use this one example that kind of makes it more difficult, because you can seek out higher-ups who would at least give you a fair hearing, or listen to you. But the other way to do it is to make your concerns noticeable by people. And one way to do that is to talk to the media. Really dangerous, but it's a way to do it. Really dangerous now, because as I said in an earlier panel, Secretary Hegseth has made it almost impossible. Well, that's not true, because now there was a lawsuit and they lost, so now people can go back into the Pentagon. The Pentagon basically said to the journalists, if you don't sign this pledge, where you are only going to report on official Pentagon business, you're going to lose your press credential and lose your workstation. So most reporters, not all, but most, did not sign it. And I was telling this story earlier today. There's a reporter from the New York Times named Erica Green, very accomplished reporter. And I was listening to something, I don't know if it was a podcast or what, but she was in her car in the Pentagon parking lot reporting, calling people, because she wasn't allowed to walk around. You used to be allowed to walk around the halls of the Pentagon, so if you want to go see this general or this person, you could do that. That's not allowed anymore. So I think that's just another, it's not easy to do, but I just keep thinking of all these young people I worked with, if they get deployed and then they have to make a decision like that, it's it's really heart-wrenching.
Thank you for the insight. Did you have something else?
Just to add on, I mean, I hear, Lorraine, you're talking about the young people. And when I was posted in Mogadishu in Somalia, we had a lot of young military guys and security guys who were out there who just had no idea. So I set up this like kind of weekly little kind of education session where we'd like sit around and I'd be like, so here's what's happening in the political situation here. You know, here's what's happening in the north and with the different clans. They had no idea because, you know, they're not there to understand the policy implications of where they are. And so there is this, you know, to a certain extent, to get a lot of people to do the horrific things that are involved in war, you know, you do need the chain of command. You need people who know that their job is to follow orders. But I also think that it's really important that, you know, they understand why we're doing what we're doing as well, so that they can be more informed to try and say something and speak out when it's wrong. And in terms of who to go to, we have official whistleblower channels to Congress, and so that is where we'd like to see a lot more of that.
I think we have time for probably one more question, unless you answer this one very succinctly, because I think it's an interesting student question. As the U.S. and many developed countries close their doors to refugees, and what role do intergovernmental organizations have in protecting the most vulnerable people on Earth?
That's not an easy question to answer quickly. I mean, I would say international organizations have a huge role in this. They, you know, they basically like run, you know, who gets to have refugee status, you know, coming out of refugee camps, and that's a type of situation. They basically kind of fund and do protect. I mean, we have UN, you know, refugee services basically run, you know, with a lot of nonprofits. They run refugee programs. They're directly responsible for protecting refugees. But I do think that they could play a bigger role in terms of lobbying and working with other countries that are amenable and helping them find a political way to accept more refugees at a time when we're not doing that here, which is very dangerous.
And the NGOs have a role to play here too, and their abilities to really be effective are also affected by all these changes, because they lobby on behalf. They might be an American organization or an American piece of an organization, and they lobby on behalf of their constituencies. And if they're like, well, you know, refugees, like, oh, are we going to like do that? Are we going to do a more domestic push? So there's this divide, and that's really, I think, kind of watering down some of the services.
So this is our last question, and it connects a little bit to the title of the panel. We have a room full of students who are inheriting this last group project. Looking back at your careers, one starting in the Foreign Service and the other in the heart of political communications, what is the one thing about how power actually works that isn't taught in political science or international relations textbooks? If these students want to make intergovernmental organizations relevant again, where should they be putting their energy? It's one thing. Well, really, if it's really just one thing, maybe just specifically where these students should be putting their energy.
This might not be a popular answer, but I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic. I think that if people, what you can do is get involved. Join a campaign of someone who shares your values, who shares your belief system, whose accomplishments you're proud of. Get involved in a campaign, in an office, a political office where you think you could put your skills to good use. My whole career has been as a practitioner, and I've appreciated when I've studied. I really have, and that's why I've enjoyed these panels so much. But that would be my one bit of advice: get an intern. If you're a student, I did this yesterday. Get an internship. I wouldn't do a White House one right now myself, but you know that could be an incredible experience. But you could do internships on the Hill or in some of these organizations we've been talking about.
Well, I have to say, as somebody who, I mean, I was a Foreign Service officer. I was a non-political bureaucrat. And it was only after I resigned and I stepped back, and I had not been involved in politics ever. I mean, I voted, but I had never, you know, I was kind of like, I'm a good bureaucrat, I'm on the inside, I'm making things better from the inside. And it was at that time when I got out and I was like, oh, damn, I guess I need to get involved in politics. Because as it turns out, politics are where the power is. We need really good diplomats, we need really good bureaucrats, we need people out there, making the systems work, but that only works if the leadership actually believes in and empowers those systems. And so at a time like this, when you see how fragile those systems are when they are undermined by political leadership, it is just reiterating that you can't do good on the inside if the political leadership you're under does not believe in the same values and outcomes as you do. So as much as I would not have wanted to hear this when I was in my 20s, and I've got lots of people in my life who are like, politics, I just want to get involved in politics, curse on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. Politics is everything. Politics is our ability to move around the world. Politics is our safety. Politics is who governs us and decides what rules we have to live by. And so please, I'm agreeing with Lorraine, get involved. Understand, support really good candidates. Get out there and find people whose values you support and help them get to where they are. The most powerful people that I know in my age range are not people who rose up through the bureaucratic system. They're people who were like a campaign staffer for Obama and then suddenly got vaulted to, Ben Rhodes, for example, vaulted to this really powerful position in the White House. That would never happen to a Foreign Service officer. And so, for that reason, but then the risk side to that is that, you're behind a candidate that doesn't work and you're like, that's not going to work. So anyway, pay attention, be involved.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you both.